sales and distribution. Check out more on our products and services at www.smgrouptt.com. Contact us at 221-7445 or email at info@smgrouptt.com. We are SM Group International, your solutions partner.
The best for your baby is at thebesttoys.com. From the best strollers, car seats, baby carriers, high chairs, booster seats, rockers, jumpers and bouncers, walkers, baby blankets, feeding accessories, bathtubs. Visit us in store or flagship at me. Shop online now at thebesttoys.com. Order via call or WhatsApp at 332-BABY. And remember, we have the best toys at the best prices.
The home of Caribbean content is growing, and we welcome you to be a part of the #1 platform for young personalities who are driven to make a positive impact in society. As we continue to reach every corner of Trinidad and Tobago through our daily broadcasts, our social media pages, or through our 75+ digital billboards across the nation. Contact us to learn about our competitive rates via marketing at wesncc.com or call us at 628-5835. WESN Content Capital, television with a difference.
WESN. So, coming down to the stretch, there's a lot to talk about, especially after the Easter vacation or specifically Easter weekend. And I believe it was this time, around this time, maybe a year or two ago, when I asked the question, to what extent do we see the Easter messages? Various institutions, public figures, they give us the Easter message, right? What does it mean? What is it worth? Do they really practice what they preach? Or is it a situation where it's a do as I say, but not as I do? Don't actually look at my example with regards to my own actions. Just listen to the words and the standards that I'm telling you to commit to, even though it seems as though I myself may or may not be willing to commit to those standards, to practice those principles, to adhere to those ideologies, to function in the manner of which I am talking about. Now, a couple things to point out at the top of the show. There was a situation apparently reported in the media, I didn't see the videos that were circulated on social media, about police liming in a bar. And the one thing about the report that I do like, but it's one of those minor things, and maybe it's almost too little too late, and to some extent it could even be undermined just a little bit. It's a quirk about public messaging. The commissioner said, I want to make it absolutely clear we are taking a zero tolerance stance on police and discipline on a whole. Now, he went on to have been quoted and said, what I saw there was totally unacceptable and will not be tolerated at all under my watch. This is, to some extent, in contrast to more generous language, where they would use words like we encourage police officers to wear body cameras, and situations where we've seen officers essentially talk back to their superiors within view of the public by the anecdotal account. Now, the thing about it is, part of it is the choice of words, and maybe it's nitpicking a man who is not that well versed in public speaking, although he is better than his predecessor, right? But it's one of those things where, to what extent, how much do you read into the minute details of what he said? We are taking a zero tolerance stance on police and discipline. There's a very, very minor implication that this could be, we are taking this stance. Not we have always took this stance. Not that the police service has always been run this way, but rather we are taking this stance. The implication is now But what about then? And therein lies the problem. And I believe he goes on to saying that, I'm saying we do not want to use a hammer to swat a fly. We want to make sure that we use the necessary discipline to show that these things will not be tolerated in police service. Basically, he doesn't want to overkill the situation, right? And they have to look at the situation in its entirety and judge it based on its merit, not try to punish these officers for the indiscretions of however many officers before them and set an example in general. It's an example, yes, but it's an example based on the merits of what they did or did not do. Not, well, we need to hit them with the full book, full hammer to send a strong enough message. So it's funny how, with regards to the actual proceedings, there's some amount of variability. But then with the messaging, I think they want to be strong, but they don't actually achieve the strength of the messaging. And when you add two and two together, it makes me wonder if it's essentially going to fall flat. Because there's no assurances that these things are not just going to be taken seriously by the words of the leadership of the police, but also will actually be implemented. Because therein lies the problem with regards to the protective services. It seems as though accountability, the first step is for us to hear the lip service. And the reason why I say lip service is, generally speaking, we could make it to this step and we have in the past, but then we don't actually see anything implemented, have anything effective, or see any difference in results. And that's why there is, well, of course, this election season, so this is a period of polls, and the police commissioner is not exempt from this because the role of the police commissioner is come under scrutiny with regards to the political lens of a general election. It's one of the main campaign issues. And the commissioner is complaining that, look, he disagrees with the findings of a poll. He doesn't understand how it could show 46% of people grading his performance as average and 17%, rating him higher than that, and you could then say that his performance is described as below par. The problem is, and this is where polls could get into trouble, to be fair, right? So it's not necessarily an issue with regards to the pollster and his methodologies, at least to some extent, right? Or the commissioner and his observations, but rather, what is average? Because technically speaking, if his performance is average for a police commissioner, I would argue that generally speaking, we have not been satisfied. The only commissioner I think has some amount of support where people would say they got satisfactory results would be Guy Griffith, but then they have a cross-section of the population. They might not be as vocal as his supporters, but they will criticize his time as commissioner and have reason to say that he was not a good commissioner. So what do you mean by average draw performance of a police commissioner? Does average mean we get average results, or does average mean the actual average of what we've seen over the last, 2 to 3 decades? In which case, the curve is kind of low. The curve is technically, of the class, is technically below passing, I would argue, because let's just look at the trend of crime. Over multiple years, the murder rate has grown. Over multiple years, you could argue the level of violence has grown, and over multiple years, the trust and service of the crime-fighting apparatus on a whole, bottlenecks with various support services like forensic testing and with regards to criminal prosecution, it's gotten worse. Prison service has had more controversial instances. The police has had more controversial instances, some under Gary's watch, some not. There's been a lot of unexplained phenomenon and poor customer service, a lot of that after Gary was removed, and questionable decisions that seem more political in nature than rooted in law enforcement, not necessarily all or most under Junior Benjamin, but at least one potentially was. or rather, it's what led him to have the job. So therein lies the question, what is average for police commissioner? And it leads me to one of the things that I've been trying to maybe interject into the conversation. We essentially, what we get is average leadership across the board. Think about it. In government, what we get is average. Now you could argue, nah, some of them real bad. No, well, the average of some certain positions and posts and institutions might be lower than others. But with regards to our political class, with regards to the leadership we've seen in police, generally speaking, with regards to the leadership we've seen in national security, for the most part, with regards to the leadership we've seen in the public sector, more often than not, we get average. And the average grade for a lot of the people taking those posts, I would argue, is not that good. But regardless, aren't we supposed to be led by people above average? Why do we want average leaders? Average leaders implies that we're not being led by the best of us. We're being led essentially by the typical of us. And there's nothing wrong with being average. I myself am an average guy, average in a lot of ways. But I'm not looking to try to take a job that requires the rest of the population to depend on me based on my average attributes. Because that's what a leader is. I'm not a leader. I'm a talk show host to some extent. I have a platform to some extent. I will drive opinion to varying degrees of the reach of the platform, etc., etc. Of course, people are free to disagree with me or not. But I'm not a leader. I'm not responsible for anybody. I'm not responsible for implementing anything. I don't have that weight of expectations. Think about it. Don't you want to be led by someone better than you? Generally speaking, when you have your social circle, or you have your extracurricular activity, whether as a school child or even as an adult, your non-work activities, there will be a hierarchy that is informally put in place. And usually the leader will be one of two people. The narcissist, who pushes his way to be leader, and everybody just lets him have his way, or her. Or the person who everyone just naturally acknowledges as being the most suited to be a leader, because they are above average in the necessary traits. They're not necessarily going to be above averages in all aspects of life. But you need someone that can actually do the job and do the job well, because what's the point? You don't necessarily want to pick leaders on the basis of them having participation trophies, or as though taking up a leadership position is, on the level of a participation trophy, not on the level of actually accomplishing something great. Now, is Junior Benjamin suffering from that? I don't know. Again, he's being graded. What do they mean by average? I will argue, sir, that even if you want to make a case, why is it below par, blah, 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 blah. All right, you're average. That's not really a good sign. And to some extent, maybe the pollster is expressing the practical reality of the situation, but they just framed it the wrong way. Therefore, you could have a debate on the accuracy of the semantics. But in the finale of the situation, we need better than average. And most people find you average. If 17% are saying that you're doing a good job, that means 83% are saying you're average or below. And I'm saying that's probably not good enough, not with the challenges we face in the criminal justice system. The sad part is he might actually technically be a lot better than most of the other candidates that may or may not be considered by the upcoming exercise to replace Ayla Ewa Christopher, when her contract naturally would have ended, the suspension and arrest notwithstanding. Last thing I want to get into, well, a couple other things. Case in point, apparently one member of the regiment was arrested by police. They found various paraphernalia that led to the interdiction of one vehicle during a roadblock. I'm not entirely sure if that Sole was charged with anything, but it's just one of those things where, why is it that it seems as though there are too many, you're not going to be perfectly clean, but there are too many questionable decisions made by members of the protective service. It's not all in the same way or the same category, right? Some of it is stuff that's done on the job. Some of it is stuff that's done not on the job. Some of it is criminal. Some of it is not criminal. But I'll just throw that out there. Why is it that there seemingly is too many questionable decisions? Let's not forget, with regards to the Coast Guard, they have their own thing to get to. With regards to the prison service, they have their own thing to get to. With regards to the police, they have their own thing to get to. With the Defense Force, we have one officer that was, and I believe the accusation was retracted, but accused of being part of a home invasion. One officer caused an accident that caused a driver to lose his life, and the regiment tried to take jurisdiction of the officer for, I don't know, weeks or months, which to me, I question the legality of it all. And now we have another officer here caught up in something. Regimental personnel, I'm not too sure if he's I don't believe he's an officer, sorry, to be frank. And then here's a bit of a warning. The Aviation, Communication and Allied Workers Union, they have suspended their Secretary General because he basically endorsed a candidate on the basis he utilized or he mentioned his office. And he basically tried to use his office to beef up his endorsement. It wasn't a personal endorsement, and the union said, you can't do that on your own unilaterally, buddy. And I do believe the union made the right call here. Now, at the end of the day, if the union doesn't want to support the candidate that the Secretary General wants to support, then he can't speak on behalf of the union. And I think this is one of those things where we may forget what representation means. And to some extent, I think this mindset goes all the way into national politics and parliamentarians, particularly members of parliament. Your job is not to tell the organization what it should or should not do. Political leaders tend to have a top-down decision-making process, regardless of their lip service towards the democratic process that we have seen over the last couple of years, right? I don't think it's reasonable to say that it is fully democratic. Although, to be fair, the PNM decided not to pick their political leader for this general election because it was too democratic, apparently, allegedly, potentially. That's the speculation, right? So to some extent, we could at least use that as a sign to say, well, hey, when they do the process, there's at least some degree of democracy to the point where they didn't want to do it right now. But again, we see high officers being the boss, not being the lead servant. You represent people does not mean that you then have the power to dictate what their opinion should be. But all too often, I hesitate to say that that's like a minor detail, but it's not, right? It's like a subtle detail, but it's not. It's something that's easily overlooked and easily glossed over and easily kind of pushed to the side, but it shouldn't. In fact, and to go a step further and to go, further away from the initial story, one of the things that I find very unfortunate, we don't understand that the MP is not there to do what local government does. In part, when MPs promise certain things, they might not have the ability to implement those promises. Period. A lot of those functions are local government functions. They may have influence, but to some extent, you don't necessarily want too much influence of an MP over a local government body. That could touch on the realm of close to corruption, let me put it that way, or impropriety, or overreach. The MP's job, member of parliament, represents the people of their constituency in parliament. Local government is there to do the things like pave the roads and see about the infrastructure and stuff. That's why property tax is supposed to go to local government, although property tax has stalled in the most interesting way that implies that the entire exercise was not done in good faith, with a lack of full explanation, transparency, or even implementation. All the while telling people, hey, you gotta pay or else. Or else what? You don't even have the tribunal up. To some extent, It is a borderline scam, the way how the messaging over property tax has been presented. But members of parliament are supposed to be representatives, not big shots, not the boss of us, and they're technically not the boss of the local government bodies. We have a whole election for that. My MP is never in the area to see about my problems. You're supposed to have councillors and aldermen to do that. Your MP is supposed to take your opinions as a constituency to parliament when bills are being debated. But let's not forget what the party line is. They say it publicly. We vote on party lines. We don't necessarily care about what the constituents of each constituency want, because we assume since they vote for us, they'll just go with us and we could dictate to them what they should think. Except, here's an international example that is, I believe, overlooked by too many people. The American election, the most interesting thing was not that Donald Trump was elected. The most interesting thing was Republican states were voting for certain measures with regards to abortion. He left it to the states, and they didn't all go conservative. Some of them took a moderate or more liberal position, because they were left to determine their own situation on their own. Now, we are not necessarily going to have constituency laws, but to what extent should MPs represent us and not try to dictate to us what should be? It's Easter, or it was Easter, and I'll go deeper with regards to the passing of the Pope. It was a bit of a surprise, but it wasn't. It kind of, you know, it's one of those things where I don't, as somebody pointed out to me just before the show, no one necessarily expected him to die, but at the same time, given his health problems, it was one of those things where it wasn't that I expected him to pass on so soon. It's just that it's not necessarily surprising to me. And that's life. 88 years old, coincidentally an auspicious number in Asian or Chinese culture, which make what you that of what you will. And also, coincidentally, he passed away right at the end of his Easter message. Now, there's one thing I wanted to mention before we take the break, and that is the fact that, and we'll get more into how Pope Francis operated. Depending on your point of view, he was a controversial figure because of some of the things that he said and the stances that he took. You know, particularly if you are very conservative in the Roman Catholic Church, I would argue. He was, you know, not necessarily the biggest controversial figure, but he was pushing boundaries to some extent. And the long and short is, he got more people to believe in religion and the church, and to potentially put aside their concerns over the acts of the humans that make up the church. Because at the end of the day, the church has a lot of controversies that people on the outside look at the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and say, hey, what are y'all doing here? This is wrong. We don't agree with this. And they take issue with the church. But to some extent, he got people to look past the mistakes of the people within the church and to still, to some extent, keep faith in the church itself as an overall organization that does represent something greater than the sum of its parts. And with the Easter messaging here, Archbishop Gordon, he has said that TNT has lost its way. And I do wonder to what degree now. It's one of those things where, and it's more pointed, he's still asking people to keep the faith in Trinidad and Tobago. TNT has lost its way, but keep the faith in Trinidad and Tobago. How do you do both at the same time? How do you deconflict that message? I think it's similar to what the Pope did for the church. We need to view our country in a similar manner. The country itself, the soil, the general society, the culture, it's not what's wrong with the country, but rather certain decisions made by individuals at various levels in society, whether it be criminals, whether it be leaders, whether it be workers, that contribute to a lot of the issues that we have. It's the people of the country, like I said, the people of the church. Any system that is a human system of organization will have one flaw across the board. Doesn't matter what the system is. As long as it involves humans, humans and human failure will be a weak point. And as I said, that the Pope got people to believe in the church, even if they had issue with the behavior of people within the church, we ourselves should look at our nation and we could criticize, as long as it's reasonable, our leaders for what they did or did not do. In fact, one priest, he went so far as to criticize himself as a leader, saying that he did not do enough. One priest himself. We could do that. We could even lose faith in people individually within our society. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to lose faith in our country. We could have faith in God. We might not like the actions of the actual church on earth, of certain priests or certain archbishops, or even the Pope himself. Not all popes are popular, and historically speaking, there's been a lot of questionable decisions done by them. But as much as a country is made up by its population and a religion is made up by its people, the ideals that are the foundations of these two different things are beyond human failure. And we could still look to them, if we believe in them, to help see us through whatever dark times are before us. So now the question is, to what extent could we take a more sophisticated stance where we are able to recognize and practice the nuances, utilize the complexity of the human brain in order to look beyond the failures of the people, or some of the people at least, that make up TNT, and still are able to keep faith in TNT. Because if we lose faith in our nation, at what point are we kind of conceding that it's over? That we've failed as a state, and we all should collectively somehow, at least those of us who can, move on and abandon ship. And then what will be left? What will be left of a culture, of a people, of a soil that means so much to us, that is in many ways unique in the world? Would it be a shame if that all were to be washed away by the ravages of time and the decisions of a people who did not have the belief in themselves to see to their own self-inflicted issues? Let's take a break. When we come back, daily review, and then of course more about the passing of what is in many ways a cultural icon in the world, the Pope. More to discuss on what it means, at least for those of us who are Catholic. Stay tuned. This is Talking Money WSN. We'll be right back after this.
My name is Dr. Joanne Williams-Cara, and I am the Director of Behavioral and Mental Health at the Community Hospital. At the Community Hospital, we believe in nurturing mind, body, and soul. Through our counseling and chaplaincy program, we will provide you with support and strength you need to help with your mental and emotional well-being. Give us a call.
When good private health care is affordable.
Welcome back to Talk About, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, we won't get into all of it today. Some of it might probably spill over tomorrow, but there's at least one story, maybe two, that I have to get through today. One, my concerns are slightly elevated. What am I speaking about? Well, let's kick off today's daily review. Oh, sorry. My apologies. I was unaware. We did it already, I've been told, in my ear. So my concerns, as I said, are heightened. And it's one of those things where, you know, maybe for some people, they're not that necessarily more concerned because of what happened in the situation. It'll be interesting to see what the public, how the public will respond to this. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And I'm speaking about what happened at Piarco Airport. Now, it looked as though it was a full setup, a full assassination. One of the things that is concerning is the fact that apparently the killers knew the target's itinerary, so they were able to strike as he came out of the arrival terminal, and I believe got into a car. I'm not entirely sure where the shooting happened, but essentially he got into a car. I don't know how far he got away from the terminal. The implication from the reports is that it was close enough to arrivals that it wasn't necessarily considered out on the road. And it's one of those things where we should be grateful that there weren't more casualties. But at the end of the day, the killers came out of a car, shot up his vehicle, I believe at least killed him. And more importantly, so not only was this a breach in what should have been a secure zone, but the ammunition that was found on the scene. This is the first murder I'm speaking about since the state of emergency ended. What did I say about the state of emergency? You could say, at the very least, it successfully suspended or suppressed the level of violence and suppressed the murder rate. We had less murders than what would have been the average for 3.5 months. Mostly everything was done with pistols during the state of emergency. And now this attack happens. It happens by the airport, in or around the airport, and it utilized not just 9mm ammunition, but 5.56 and 7.62 rifle rounds, high-powered rifle rounds. 5.56, the type you will see in AR-15s or modern-day rifles, and the larger 7.62 ammunition, that's the type you will see in older automatic rifles from the Cold War days. Those have a lot higher firepower, penetrating power, range, right? It's just a more powerful round. You might still see those rounds being used in certain sniper rifles, whether extreme range sniper rifles or even like hybrid rifles utilizing M14s with scopes and the like. The point is, a car door ain't stopping that. In fact, a car door probably is not going to stop a 9mm round. When you see people in a movie hide behind a car door, listen, if you are a private FEL user, don't do that. Don't do that. If you need to take cover behind your engine block. But that's besides the point. The point is, we're seeing rifles now being taken. There's no pistol that uses a 7.62 round, right? So rifles are back on the table with regards to utilizing as murder weapons. And this was an attack by what should be one of the most secure facilities in the entire country. It should be. There's the Red House, there's police headquarters, there's the Prime Minister's and President's residences, you know, there's the prisons, there's the airport. These are some of the things that are supposed to be the most secure facilities in the country. And this happened at the airport. However, I'll say this, with regards to the airport, it's a lot harder to secure than a lot of those other places. And it's not that as easy to secure as we think. I would argue that this murder was allowed to happen not because necessarily a lapse in security, but because the level of violence in the country, the poor murder detection rate, the deficiencies in the criminal justice system, the system overall breaking down, and the reasonable, usual measures of security not being able to keep up with the excessive consequences as a result. Similar to what I said with regards to schools not being able to handle the level of violence, because at some point it goes beyond what their reasonable systems can deal with. How often are you going to suspend a kid? And they're suspending, in some cases, you know, so many times it's beyond what is the guideline. Then do you just expel them? But If the child is wanting to engage in criminal activity and be affiliated with a gang, expelling them, how does that actually rectify the problem? Now, 2 a.m. Thursday night, they knew he was coming, right? One of the other passengers in the vehicle, apparently, I'm not sure if it was the driver, he was also shot in both legs. Now, one of the things is that this situation became political, as it does. So, UNC candidate Roger Alexander, one of the things he's quoted saying is, how can you be thinking and not put proper legislation and policies in place to protect your domestic airport? How? It's the first place where terrorism might want to raise its ugly head, but it is exposed. Now, I'll say this, and he is warned, it left a blot in the country's international reputation. To some extent, that line of thinking, I can't fully fault it because I had that same thought with regards to the airport in Crown Point, because the airport in Crown Point, significant parts of the airport that should be within the inner workings of the airport, as opposed to Piarco, are exposed to the public. You could see from the road, one of the gates that you take, those sky bridges, or I forget the correct term, that you take to board the aircraft. Now in Piarco, those things are located behind the terminals where, you know, departures, arrivals, where the public and the road traffic would be able to see in close proximity, right? You have to go into the airport to actually get there. The tarmac itself is relatively well secured, and a far enough distance away that you can't interfere with it anyway. But hey, we have parts of the Crown Point Airport right next to a road. So Roger Alexander brought up terrorism. If you want to talk about terrorism, yes, of course, to some extent, parts of the airport will always have to be near the road, and they will be more vulnerable than other parts. But you would hope that the parts where the planes, where terrorists may want to strike, that would be a little bit more secure, maybe not. But one of the things, though, that I do have to ask, and he also brought up the fact that, look, the airport ought to be a sanctuary, and he points out the fact that leaders of the country, foreign dignitaries, everybody has to use the airport. The thing is, on a practical level, this sort of attack is not as simple to guard as it may seem. And to some extent, certain acts of terrorism, if the perpetrators want to carry out an extreme enough action, there are many vulnerabilities in our country. I won't necessarily speak about them, because then I could be accused of something or the other, right? But there are many vulnerabilities of our country. It doesn't take too much effort to figure out some of them. And an attack like this is similar to when people are gunned down outside of a police station. I guess the whole idea is to get people, when you get them off guard, because they're in an area where they're supposed to be safe, and you're saying, no, we could ambush you in that area. So, oh, you just left a police station, we could ambush you. You're now leaving the arrivals terminal, we could get you. The thing is, on a practical level, they don't actually have to do it there. They could have shot up the victim's car on the road. They just needed to pull alongside it and shoot it up if they so wanted. Pull alongside it at one of the traffic lights leading out of Piarco, if they so wanted. They could have tailed them until they went to somewhere more remote, if they so wanted. It is a testament to the fact that our national security apparatus is so broken down that the criminals could be so brazen. But to say that this murder was completely prevented, we could have maybe prevented it from happening within the airport area. But let's be real, it'll take a lot more than just, you could put all the security within the airport you want. The murder will just be moved to somewhere else. It speaks to the larger problems of that overall breakdown, that if we want things like these murders to not take place, the fact that it was in the airport area was just the icing on the cake, right? To emphasize the point that things aren't so hot. But to some extent, again, depending on how extreme the criminal wants to be, preventing the act, right, actively, proactively preventing the act is not that easy. The whole idea about policing for preventative measures is that if you could prove to criminals that they will be punished, they will not do the act. Al Capone and the Untouchables never actually went after the real-life Elliot Ness, never actually tried to kill him. I believe somebody he did maybe put a bounty on his head, but then retract that, and at the end of the day, Elliot Ness was never threatened with physical violence. He himself never carried a gun in real life, not talking about the movie. Because, why? Even at the heyday of judges in his pocket and all the corruption, Al Capone didn't want the heat of a federal agent being killed. The escalation would be too much to bear. But we don't seemingly, we have that to some extent. That's why certain lines have not been crossed, but it seems as though criminals are pushing the boundaries and seeing what lines can they cross. And to what extent do we have to, are we confident rather, that there will be certain lines they will never cross? We don't know. Some of these street gangs are no longer being controlled by the drug lords. That's why the level of violence is what it is in some cases. Preventing crime is not as easy as you think. So the whole idea is the consequences have to be there, and then that will stop people in their tracks from going too far. But we don't have the consequences, so we have what we have. Security measures like cameras and police on site, it can only do so much. That's why when the Commissioner of Police is promising more security, faster response, etc., I'm kind of doubtful. What can you actually do except flood the zone with police? So if someone opens fire near the airport, they could shoot back. But think about what we're saying. And we've had police officers on this show say it already. Criminals are not going to care about who's at the airport. Remember, the victim, regardless of if he was a criminal or not, known to the police or not, was involved in anything that some people might say he deserved to die or not, I don't know. He's the victim. He now arrived on an international flight. There were other people. One would assume he was within a group of people. He got his bag within a group of people. He exited the arrivals area with a group of people. He got into a car. Usually when there's a flight, what do you see? A lot of cars picking up people on that side of the airport, right? Now, to what extent are we lucky? Because criminals don't care about what's in the backfield when they open fire. More security means that it might, if criminals want to test the security, we might get a gunfight right in proximity to civilians. And in the past, that's gone okay. Like the incident in Ryson Road, where the police handled that. I praised them at the time and still do. But other times, it doesn't go very well. Like with what happened with that poor lady through her window, and that's not the only case where something like that happened. So I'm not too sure exactly what security measures the police could put in place for public areas like the airport. It's a whole different kettle of fish when it comes to like the Red House and the judiciary and the prisons and what have you. Because look, they got a gun in the prison. Wonder, will somebody smuggle a gun in the judiciary at some point? But in a public place like the airport, there's only so much effective things you could do without hampering the flow of the public in an airport, which is a mass transit hub. It's not about individual 1 or 2 people every hour getting a taxi at the airport. We're talking masses of people coming and going, right? How are you going to effectively prevent violence there if you don't have consequences to back up your criminal justice system? That's why when the minister said the SOE is not ruled out after the airport killing, believe it or not, I don't think that stance is unreasonable. It might not be popular, it might be bad because we're going into a general election, and it might be really tricky because I don't know how that works without parliament. Maybe this will have to be something after the general election if the new government wants to do it or not. But I think, and I get it, the Minister Gonzalez is saying that there needs to be an in-depth investigation into what went wrong with the security apparatus there. But I would argue that, to some extent, it's not about the security apparatus at the airport. Because again, unless you could get wind of the act of violence potentially happening, how are you going to guard against it? Unless you see the guns in the car, and the perpetrators probably never left the car that they were in until they saw their target, got out, opened fire, got back in, and left. Now, unless you have a police officer right there, or an armed security guard right there, and I don't know to what extent airport police are trained and equipped to deal with something like that, where at least 2 rifles, because there was 2 different rifle ammunitions, were found at the scene. So at least 2 rifles were shot into another vehicle. Even if they could return fire or open fire on the perpetrators, the deed most likely is already done and they're going to escape anyway. That's not prevention. Prevention means to prevent the attack from happening at all. I don't know if any, outside of literally caging the airport and every car that comes in has to go to ridiculous security checks, the type of which will probably slow things down to the point of it being impractical, or you'll need so much manpower that it will be impractical. I don't know. But I can understand a lot of people are going to be looking at the security apparatus at the airport broke down. No. At some point, society exists because there's a social contract. It is very easy for individuals to hurt other individuals. We just choose not to do it. That is the difference between most citizens and criminals. The choice. Because the police will never be able to prevent all acts of violence. All they could do is respond to it. And again, part of why we do not harm each other, the normal average citizen, is because we either and or have a respect for the law, respect for a fellow human being, but also, at least for some of us, we fear consequences. Some of it could be all of the above, some of it could be either or with some people. Regardless, whatever the motivation is, that's the reality. There's a majority of the population that would not shoot up the airport. But we need to understand that the problem has gotten so big now that those expectations are thrown out the window for a group of the population. That social contract, you don't harm me, I don't harm you, let's respect each other, let's be civil, let's not be chaotic and unruly and disrupt public order, that's lost on criminal elements. Because that is definitely part of the group that needs to fear the consequences to prevent the most extreme actions. And right now, minimum 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5 murderers, I believe. We haven't gotten an update on the murder detection rate in a while, but given, I might be overestimating, 4 out of 5 will potentially get away scot-free. Those are betting odds. All right. It's an escalation. We have literally gotten back from the level of suppression from the state of emergency. We are back to more high-powered weapons, more spray and pray. We were lucky there weren't unintended casualties or more unintended casualties in this situation. And the question that I'm hesitant to ask, because at this point, I'm not superstitious, but hey, we have nothing else going for us. The last thing you want is to goat-mouth the situation even further, right? Why bother? Why risk piling on? But how much worse could it get? Hospitals, airports, proximity to schools, check. Proximity to police stations, check. How much worse can I get? Gun in a prison, maximum security prison, check. How much worse can I get? Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the Pope. Stay tuned. This is Talking About the WSN. We'll be right back after this.
My name is Dr. Stephen Carroll, the CEO at Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventists, and we are committed to making good private health care affordable.
For all your medical needs, including dental, radiology, laparoscopy, behavioral and mental health, along with many other services, contact us for more information at 235-5477. Where good private health care is affordable.
So, coincidentally, the following day, there was $400,000 in cocaine found at the airport. Not sure if it's connected, haven't necessarily got more information on that bust. It was found hidden in the vehicle of a car. They arrested the suspect. Not too sure exactly if they expected that to get on a plane, but it is what it is. Let's not forget, according to the government, more contraband comes through the legal ports of entry than the illegal ones, particularly the guns. That was their defense about the porous borders. It was, no. The guns come through the legal ports, not the illegal ports. One of those is Peoc International Airport. There was even a National Geographic episode. We showed the clip on one of the earliest episodes of Talking Point in our first year, in maybe our first couple of months, where the American authorities interdicted handguns being smuggled to Piaco via Miami through a flight, through basically hand luggage. It was, I think, maybe like 2 handguns or something, but still the point remains. That was an old episode, maybe 2017 or so. One wonders how much worse could it have gotten, because again, if you could get a gun in the hands of a prisoner, what can't you do in TNT? Now, like I said, we get into the Pope, an interesting figure with regards to modern religion that potentially pushed the boundaries of how we view religion, how Catholics viewed their religion, how Christians maybe viewed their religion, and how we viewed certain aspects of our society given the commentary that the Pope provided on them, but not necessarily did he change church policy. Was it because of internal politics or not? Who knows? I have a clip from our affiliate France 24. They had a discussion, but we'll just present to you some of the general information with regards to the papacy of Pope Francis. It's time to cue this.
White smoke spiraling from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel made Jorge Maria Bergoglio the first non-European pope in 1300 years. Born in Argentina in 1936 to Italian immigrant parents, he grew up in a modest family in Buenos Aires. During his studies, Jorge Bergoglio worked as a janitor and a nightclub bouncer, an unusual profile, but one that didn't prevent him from climbing the ladder within the church. He was appointed bishop, then archbishop, before being appointed as Cardinal of Buenos Aires in 2001. Nicknamed Prince of the Poor, he made clear he wouldn't live in the Vatican like his predecessors, instead choosing to reside at St. Martha's Guest House with other clergy members.
Perché lei
I was wondering, why did you give up all the wealth of a pope?
I have a need to live among the people.
For his first visit outside Rome, the pontiff chose the Italian island of Lampedusa, where thousands of migrants died attempting to reach its shores. Pope Francis also spoke out for societal stances like homosexuality.
If a person is gay and willingly seeks the Lord, who am I to judge?
Whilst it was a change in message, it wasn't a change in doctrine, as the Vatican reaffirmed that homosexuality is a sin. Pope Francis's statements have been controversial within the Catholic Church, who have tried to maintain unity within it. In February 2019, the Pope held an unprecedented international summit where he said that the Church was ready to take responsibility for abuse against children.
The Church will do whatever is necessary to bring to justice anyone who has committed such crimes.
Pope Francis also emphasized a more inclusive Catholic Church, but this earned him criticism of conservatives who accused him of diluting the Church's teachings. And a stinging criticism of the Curia, the Church's central government, meant many in the Vatican have long wanted to see him go. After an exhausting journey to Canada in July, he hinted he might follow the unusual example set by his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, and resign from the role.
This, with all honesty, is not a catastrophe. There can be a change of popes.
For his critics, Francis did not behave like a pope should, but his supporters will remember him for his simplicity, vibrant personality, and his empathy for the poor.
When Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis in 2013, he was immediately hailed as a new type of leader, a progressive following decades of conservatism under his predecessors Benedict XVI and John Paul II. And he seemed set to upend some of the long-time teachings of the Roman Catholic Church.
There are some things to reform. The Church always has to reform itself.
From the beginning, Pope Francis reached out to the LGBTQ+ community, long marginalized by the Church. He said it was not up to him to judge them, and he was vocal in condemning laws against homosexuality.
Being homosexual isn't a crime. It's part of the human condition.
He continued to say no to same-sex marriage, but in 2023 approved blessings for same-sex couples, though he clarified that priests could bless the two people in the relationship, but not the union itself. While Francis criticised what he called gender ideology, which he said sought to erase differences between women and men, he broke bread with transgender people and said they should be accepted.
The fact that Pope Francis is bringing transgender people closer to the Church is a beautiful thing, because we need some love.
Francis did sometimes stumble. In 2024, the Vatican apologized after he used a homophobic slur when he was speaking in private about his opposition to allowing gay men into the priesthood, a change that did happen this year. There are still no female priests in the Catholic Church, let alone bishops or cardinals. And despite hopes that that might have begun to change under Francis,
Ordain women! Ordain women!
He ruled out the ordination of women. But during his papacy, women gained more influence than ever in the highest echelons of the Catholic Church. He appointed a number of women to senior leadership positions in the Vatican. Francis resisted calls to re-examine the rule of celibacy for priests, but in his later years he showed signs of bending on this. In the face of a crisis of recruitment to the priesthood, he talked of rethinking the rule in locations where there was a shortage of clergy. Marriage is sacred and divorce is impossible under Catholic law, but Francis called for more understanding, saying that Catholics who have civil divorces and remarry should not be shunned by the Church. There were some red lines that were impossible for Francis to cross. He always remained unmoving on the Catholic Church's complete opposition to contraception and abortion.
Be sanctities of respect for life, proclaiming the sacredness of the every human life from conception to natural death.
He also reaffirmed the Church's opposition to in vitro fertilization and called for a global ban on surrogate pregnancy.
A child is always a gift and never the object of a commercial contract.
Francis may not have been the sweeping reformer that progressive believers had hoped for, but the late Pope changed the tone of the Vatican. He helped people who once believed the Catholic Church had no place for them to feel more welcome, and he pushed the institution to live up to the meaning of its name, the Universal Church.
So here we have what arguably is a cultural icon. It's one of those things. There's the Dalai Lama, there's the Pope. I don't really know of any other spiritual leader in the world as an individual. There are other religions, but the other religions do not necessarily concentrate their leadership into one individual that could be pointed to. And to some extent, ironically, these are the religions that they have some political influence. Yes, of course, the Vatican is even an observer to the UN, but I don't believe it's still technically not a member. The Dalai Lama is connected to the government in exile of Tibet, but they are more cultural and spiritual leaders as opposed to political ones, right? In the past, it might not have been so, but we get where we get today. Not too dissimilar to the royal family of England and maybe some of the other royal families, but like the royal family of England, or at least the Queen, the deceased Queen of England, whoever sits in the position of the Pope potentially is a cultural icon. I would argue that Pope Francis's predecessor was not, but Pope Benedict's predecessor was. Now, one of the largest religions of the world, and it is one of the larger or largest religions in TNT. The passing of this Pope brings a lot of questions. One, of course, is to what extent were people in agreement or not with some of the views that he had, because it may then, at least for the cardinals who now have to select another pope or a new pope, it may inform them on how things are going to be moving forward. Now, to what extent do we here in TNT, are we hoping for someone who's not a European, for instance? Some people might want a pope who is not necessarily of Caucasian descent. Or rather, some might be looking at what will be the potential policies of the Pope moving forward. I could agree with a lot of what he said, and in some cases, the positions that he took were in an attempt to maybe push the boundaries, to push the envelope, but he himself identified that he could only go so far. And there are a lot of nuances to the positions that he took with regards to trans people, for instances. Accepting trans people and looking with regards to policies on gender identity, those are not necessarily the same thing. And with regards to abortions, one of the things where the church is consistent, and I could agree with them for the most part on this, is it's about respecting the sanctity of life. And to some extent, it might frustrate people to know, but the church locally, it's not just lip service. They are against the death penalty. They have gone and spoken and done work with inmates. They believe in rehabilitation, and death is taking the opportunity for rehabilitation away from inmates, so they're against the death penalty. It's a principle that they hold true to their beliefs, to their core. And I could appreciate that, even though technically speaking, I don't know if I would agree with that stance of the death penalty or not, in part because freedom of religion is a hell of a thing. Regardless of what my personal beliefs are or not, society as a whole has a right to determine what it wants on that issue, regardless of religion. With regards to LGBTQ stuff and the like, you know, those are sensitive things, but I think for the most part, members of that community were satisfied with Pope Francis's position. Maybe some of the people in the church, some officials, were not, ironically, as the report said. But one of the things that I do have questions with regards to is with the rule of celibacy for priests and ordaining women. Now, the rule of celibacy, it's practical to some extent. Priests are overworked. Arguably speaking, right now, some of the worst candidates for fatherhood would be priests who are carrying out their functions in TNT. They are literally just that busy. In part, however, and this is the catch, because there are not enough priests. So to what extent will removing those rules allow the recruitment of more priests to take place around the world? And then lies the real issue, where I think as time goes on, it will become more and more of an unnecessary debate. Women and the priesthood, yes or no? There are roles for women in the church. Other Christian religions have broken those barriers. And one of the things that we need to understand, those roles, those gender roles existed historically for very practical reasons. But the catch is, in modern times, a lot of those practical reasons potentially no longer exist. To what extent should that debate happen and women should be allowed to be priests? To be honest, I don't know. I don't have an opinion of it. It's not an issue that I have delved into, and it's not anything that I feel strongly about one way or the other. It's just one of those things where I think the church potentially needs to face that question proactively, as opposed to trying to avoid it and pushing it to the side and not really speaking to it. Again, it could go to the fact of the amount of priests available. We have a shortage here in TNT. It's just one of those things. And it's interesting that at an age where Pope Francis may have potentially reversed to some extent the public perception of the church, there's still issues with recruiting priests to continue the work of the church. That's why you sometimes have to get foreign priests. It's not dissimilar to having to get foreign nurses or foreign doctors. But it's not limited to just us. And now we have to look and see what this Pope will mean for the church and how it will potentially affect the perception of the church. But to take a lesson from that international body, whose members dwarfs our population, to be fair, to be frank, they had a problem with how they were being perceived. A very real human feeling where they had the scandals of sexual abuse of minors by members of the clergy that the church covered up. And I don't believe it was for any nefarious purpose. There was some secret sex trafficking ring or anything like that. But rather, it was the very human feeling of giving in to the fear, we can't afford the church to look bad, so we need to cover it up. Unfortunately, stuff eventually comes to light. Nothing can be hidden in darkness forever. And then you get what you get. But it's a very real feeling that you see in our own leaders. They don't want to talk about things. They don't want to express certain things. They want to hide certain things away. More often than not all of it comes to light, but some does. And in fact, I guess this is where we in TNT fall behind the rest of the world. Because while the church has not necessarily fully inflicted consequences on perpetrators in all those situations, and has successfully gotten away with transferring clergy around and kind of suppressing it to some extent, not totally, they did face consequences by the public. Even if the perpetrators maybe got away with their acts without any punishment, the church itself as a body did face consequences by the public. But yet, we have similar situations like that report with regards to the abuse of minors, who rarely face consequences. Because at the very least, the court of public opinion is supposed to cause that negative light. Okay, well now the church is not as popular as it was. It's viewed more negatively. It's engaged with less. It's potentially losing followers. And the church has to continue to work on that issue to turn things around. Meanwhile, what happens in TNT? Well, less people vote, but it doesn't matter. What matters is not how many people vote for you, but rather only that you have more votes than the other guy. If only 200 people voted and 101 voted for the PNM and 99 voted for the UNC, that's all that counts. The fact that hundreds of voters, thousands, hundreds of thousands did not vote, no one will bat an eye. The lack of engagement in our society is not an issue for people, as it was for an organization like the Roman Catholic Church. It allows our political class to essentially get away with certain things. Oh, we're not popular. But here's the key point that I'll never fully understand. At some point, why is it that a politician or a party look at the situation and say, hey, we all kind of making the same mess and we're losing voter engagement. Yes, the base will still support us, but all the undecided voters and young people, they might look at us and they say we don't want nothing to do with them, right? And as long as both sides keep acting in a manner that will leave them as unpopular as they are, then it's fine. They're competing on a level playing field and they'll just continue doing what they're doing. But one would think that somebody would figure out, hey, maybe if we actually, I don't know, just be better than the other side, not have as much controversy, be a bit more transparent, show that we could have a bit more accountability in how we do things. It should be easy, right? And yet somehow accountability, transparency, better communication, better leadership, doing the right thing, somehow these concepts are really hard for politicians to implement. It has to be either that or there's no actual competition per se. It's a political cartel and they're just playing tennis with whoever's in government. And they don't necessarily mind not winning an election every now and then. That's the implication. Because what should be a competitive election, at the very least, I mean, the incumbent's disadvantage notwithstanding, there's so many self-inflicted mistakes. And that's what happened with the church. That's what Pope Francis had to deal with. The self-inflicted mistake of trying to cover up a scandal that was abhorrent. This is one of the things that even prisoners in the American prisons don't tolerate. Inmates that mess with children. That gets out into the prison population. You could end up, if you're a perpetrator of such a crime, you could end up dead. Even murderers have that as their standard. And members of the church were allegedly engaging in such acts. The church tried to cover it up, as opposed to saying we could be better. But we don't have that in our political class here. We don't have that incentive to be better, despite the fact that the church is competing with all religions, but to some extent, it's not at the same time, right? You are born into religion like you're born into a political party, but it seems as though the competition of our politics isn't really that effective. And it undermines the meritocracy of our politics, similar to how, allegedly, we don't promote commissioner of police based on merit. We promote them based on seniority, because the minister is, in the press report that I've said, for us to not promote based on seniority or to ignore seniority, we'll need new legislation. Our politicians are more based on seniority than merit. It's interesting all of this happens during the Easter vacation. And it leads me right back to where I began. A couple of years ago, I believe, I questioned the messages, because every vacation, every religious situation, Eid, Christmas, Easter, Lent, Diwali, what do we get? It might have been actually Diwali, not Easter. Or maybe Diwali might have been the first time that I noticed it personally, but Easter may have been when I spoke out about it. At this point, I can't be entirely sure. But all of these religious festivals, they promote certain ideals and principles, and it seems as though we've kind of forgotten how to truly practice them. We want them, we say we want them, but when push comes to shove, at some point, we forget the fact that democracy is not easy. And that we, at the end of the day, if we really want this higher level of human society, we have to earn it. We're not entitled to it. I honestly believe that certain ancient civilizations like Greece and Rome were far more sophisticated than the average person might assume, because, you know, it was so much in the past, so they're just superstitious, cowardly people that are simplistic in their mindset. No, Greece gave us philosophers whose teachings were to some extent some of the basis of modern philosophical thought. And they also created the concept of democracy. They practiced democracy, and then the world regressed, both in Greece and Rome, and then the world regressed into various forms of monarchy, feudalism. In the latter stages of the empire, into the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, and so on. And in the case of Rome, to what extent did their society collapse? Not because of the enemy at the gates, but because the weight of their internal governance eventually caused a society to effectively start to fray and collapse. And it was then hastened by the eventual people that sacked Rome itself. We don't necessarily have to fear being sacked by an enemy at the gates, but perhaps that makes the whole situation more survivable, more correctable, but also all the more tragic. And it's not just us, it's the world. Look at what's going on around the world with governments around the world. It's almost as though, think about it, they can't get out of their own way. People might say, oh, look at Trump, look at Trump, look at Trump. But what about his predecessor, Biden? Somebody from the other political side. At the end of the day, could we say that his presidency was all that grand, was all that positive, was all that great? Probably not. People might want to say, well, in the past, Obama, and maybe Bush Sr., Clinton, Reagan, maybe not Bush Jr. But I would argue, yes, but the point is we're seeing a pattern. We're seeing a pattern where democracies are now becoming more and more confrontational internally. The differences which should be utilized to help forge more effective and efficient solutions are being utilized rather to divide and conquer. And that's what's being done here in TNT. So, if the church could have such feelings, so are we. But I would argue that we need much more aggressive change to deal with our perception issue. How we perceive our government, how we perceive our criminal justice system, how we perceive our education system, how we perceive our society. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. It's a big, big, big issue. It's a wide-ranging topic. How are we going to get there with average leaders? How are we going to get there with low expectations of ourselves for ourselves? I hope, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, and I might even say it after the election, but if it looks as though nothing really is going to change from the results, because we get more or less the typical type of result, regardless of how the seats play out, and we look at the situation and we don't really see a way for the status quo to change, then I would think that we as a society failed at the election, regardless of who's voted in. Because I don't think you could look to any one party at this point to say, save us. There's too many questions with all of them. but also none of them have really proven the capacity to deal with the scale of the issues that we have before us. Think about that. If you think that they have, I challenge you. We have 3 more days. If you think that we have that capacity, somebody has that capacity. We have 3 more days before the election, basically. On Monday, we can't really talk about too much political stuff, if any at all. Let me know who, how. Because I would argue, even the best that we've had, I don't know if they would have the capacity, the ability to realign our course, to right the ship. Because the weight of our societal expectations and the baggage of all the negativity that has happened and all of the various minor agendas that are now influencing how the country is being run, all of the individual agendas, not all of them for the sake of the country. Some of them, maybe they do think it's for the sake of the country, but effectively not getting a result that is for the benefit of the country. To deal with all of that. And it's not just political agendas by politicians, it's also the agendas of certain unions, certain private businesses, certain communities even. So many of us have kind of lost the point of a nation where we view our fellow citizens not as our brothers and sisters, despite the fact that I hate it when politicians use that phrase. It sounds so stereotypical, cliched. But at the end of the day, our fellow citizens are brothers and sisters, and yet we mistreat our families so badly. All right. Let's not go over time today, although we did start a bit late, but let's keep things short. Didn't really formally open up the phone lines, but at the end of the day, you could leave comments or call in tomorrow if you had anything to say. I know it's a vacation time, so I don't expect a lot of people looking to want to engage right now. Probably going to have a lot of people maybe catching this episode of Talking Point in one of our reruns or via our social media platforms on our Facebook page, WSNCC, on Facebook and YouTube. You can catch everything there. But we have a week, basically. What are we going to do with it? Is it too late? I don't know. You tell me. Not necessarily in tomorrow's show. Tell me on Monday with your vote. In the meantime, have a good day. Stay safe. Remember your allegiance to this Twin Island Republic and to each other. And as always, never forget that it's nice to be nice. And we'll see you tomorrow morning. Or tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN